We are here interviewing, sir, what is your name?
Dr. Michael A. Silverman.
Okay, all right. And yes, sir, how long have you been here at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center?
About 7 years.
What is your current address? Let's start
West
off.
Palm Beach VA Medical Center, Palm Beach, Florida.
Great. And when is your birthday?
9/26/1944.
Okay. And the people at the interview are myself, Carlton Cartwright, the Executive Director for the Children's Coalition Incorporated.
Roger that.
Mario Romero and Guillermo Tercero, my student assistants. Okay, and roger that. Okay. All right. So what wars or branch of service did you serve in, Doc?
Repeat that.
What branch of the service were you in?
United States Army.
Okay, and what
Who,
wars? What wars were you in?
Well, I actually was called up for 20 months active duty for OEF, OIF, but I volunteered to go overseas, but they sent me to headquarters, so I was in for 20 months during the Iraqi war, but I couldn't get over to Iraq. I was at headquarters for the reserve.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, what was your rank?
I retired as an '06 colonel.
Oh, okay. All right. And so where did you serve? Where did you do your 20 months?
Well, I was in for reserve many years and active duty for 20 months. I served for 35 years.
Oh.
So in that period of time, I got to a lot of different Army bases, including Fort Gordon, Fort Benning, Fort McPherson, Fort Drum. I was there for a short time, Fort Riley, Sill, doing different things for the Army, as well as, Benning and Fort Stewart, Knox. So I got to a lot of bases. Also, I was overseas 6 times with the Army. Besides, I was in Guatemala, I was in Honduras, I was in El Salvador, and I was in the Amazon.
Huh.
So I served 6 times overseas with the Army as a physician.
Okay. Wow. That's pretty extensive. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
When I got in 1971, at that time, I had my physical exam. I was going to be drafted, actually, and to be taken out of my residency. So at that time, I wanted to finish my residency. Mm-hmm. At that time, doctors usually didn't, but now everybody's required. So I knew that it was going to be important. So I tried to get in a reserve unit so I could finish my residency, but they were going to draft me out of it. So I was ready to be drafted. And actually my chief of medicine said, you can't leave my program. I need you because you're my 3rd-year resident. So next thing I know, I got a call from the state of Maryland that said, report to the National Guard Armory on Monday. And I did, and they put me into the 7 years, but I stayed in for 35.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment. Where were you living at the time that you entered the service?
At the time I entered, I lived in Baltimore, Maryland.
Why did you join? Were you drafted?
Well, at that time, I was going to be, but I joined voluntarily the National Guard.
Gotcha. Okay. Why did you pick that branch?
Well, my aunt was in the Air Force. She was a career Air Force. Mm-hmm. My stepfather was a captain in the Navy in World War II and Coast Guard. Mm-hmm. And I always liked the Army. I liked Army medicine.
Okay. Where did you do basic training or boot camp?
Well, Several places, but most of it was in Maryland, where we were at. I was at Fort Lee, and then in Virginia, and then I was at what we call Camp Pickett back then in AP Hill, where I did most of it
Okay.
in the old days.
So what was that like? Remember your instructors? What was it like?
I mean, to me, I was always pretty fit. I was a wrestler in school and a weightlifter, so it wasn't too bad. And I was a physician, so it wasn't too bad at all. I mean, I always believed in being there with all the rest of the troops, whether I was a doctor and an officer or not. That was my goal, is that you got to pull your part of it. You can't expect other people to do it. You got to do your share.
Okay. So 35 years ago. How long ago was that?
1971 through 2006.
1971. So did you go to Vietnam, or did you go overseas
No,
at that time?
At that time, I finished my residency, and
Where were you?
then I did a fellowship
Where'd you do
in
that?
Baltimore, the residency,
Gotcha.
and then I wanted to do my training, and I did it in Hem-Onc. And then when I finished,
Where?
oncology, I became a cancer specialist
Where
in
was
Miami, Florida,
Hem-Onc?
University of Miami.
Ah. Okay.
So when I finished, that was my time to go.
Uh-huh.
But the war finished in 1975. So I stayed in after that.
All right. So then where were you stationed after that?
Well, I was in the reserve.
Okay. All right.
So I was in different places for 2 weeks of training.
A year.
And then we met 1 weekend a month.
Okay. So, and where did you do your reserve duty? So you've been in the reserve all these years.
Most except for the 20 months on active duty.
All right. And when did you do that?
The active duty was 2004 or 5 for the Iraqi War, IOEF, OIF.
So prior to that,
A 20-some years
right.
Army Reserve. I joined the reserve when I moved from Baltimore to Miami. I went from the National Guard into the reserve.
Okay.
And so I worked in the reserve unit in Miami, where we had a general hospital, eventually became a combat support hospital, and I was a commander of the general hospital for a while, and then also of the combat support hospital.
So did you see a lot of casualties?
Most of what we saw was an annual training and taking care of active duty at that time at different bases like Fort Stewart, Fort Benning.
Give me those states. Where's Fort Stewart at?
That's in Georgia.
Okay.
It's in Hinesville, Georgia.
So you would be deployed there, so to speak?
Well, we would go there for 2 weeks.
Uh-huh.
So we go to in the reserve. You do that.
So every year, in other words, you went someplace different.
Every year for 30-some years, I did that.
Okay.
1 weekend a month,
Uh-huh.
and then 2 weeks during the year for training.
Right.
On the base.
Okay. So, and were you seeing, when you went on these TDYs for 2 weeks, were you seeing a lot of casualties coming back from overseas?
Well, we did. I mean, I saw a lot of, vets from Vietnam.
Okay.
And we worked just like a regular Army doctor in the hospital, taking care of active duty personnel. That's what we did.
Okay.
Or else we went to places like Camp Landing, where
Where's that?
National Guard trained in Florida, and took care of the troops during their training. So when they got hurt, we took care of them, and then we had play mass casualty. So we trained to be ready in case we went over. This was most of it during the Cold War.
Uh-huh. Okay. All right. So were there ever any casualties in your unit?
Well, I was not in my unit, but when I was at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, one of the young ladies in another unit was accidentally killed.
Ooh.
I saw, when I was overseas, I saw, how to take care of guys that got hurt, infections, you name it, sew them up. So, at that time,
So that
snake
was
bites, things like that.
during that 20 months.
No, that was, when we go overseas, like when I was in Honduras,
Yeah.
or I took care of our troops that were on missions there.
Those were on those 2-week.
Well, yeah, or longer.
Okay. So I'm just trying to get some chronology going here, and I know you went to a lot of places, so I'm just trying to get a jump off point and try to work through that date wise.
Okay.
If you follow what I'm saying.
Sure. Well, first time we went overseas was 1987,
Mm-hmm.
and I was in mission in the Amazon jungle.
Right.
We had a base camp. The U.S. Army was building roads because of the recent earthquake, and I was the only physician at that time for about 3-4 weeks in Ecuador. It was in the jungle in the Amazon, and so any of our casualties that got injured, I took care of. They weren't being actively shot or that, but they were being injured with road building. They had to be sewn up.
Right.
There was a lot of infection, so I was involved with taking care of our troops at that time.
Okay.
And then I think it was in 91, we were 91 overseas in Honduras. And at that point, I ran the troop medical. I guess we set up a small little hospital in the field in Honduras in a base camp.
Right.
And we did have a perimeter. It was a hostile area with M60s every, I don't know how many yards, but it was barbed wire enclosed. If you got near the fence, it was shoot to kill, because there were leftist guerrillas in Honduras and Nicaragua at that time. So I took care of our troops that were injured or had tropical problems. I took care of Honduran troops who had malaria. I took care of our troops when they got sick, infectious disease, diarrhea, injury, fractures, things like that. So we took care of there in the base camp. Then I was in El Salvador in 95. In 95, we were actually on the base with that was their caballeria. It was a base for their horse cavalry, which was a showcase, but at that time I was taking care of our troops, and also we did what they call a medret, where we actually went to villages with other doctors that were from the home country, like El Salvador, and then we helped the people. So I did a medret in 1995, and actually I published it in a paper published in Military Medicine in 1998. So about our experience, and when I was in Ecuador, we published a paper in 1990 in Military Medicine on what we did there. And then back in 2000, we went back to El Salvador. We were in a base camp there called El Limon, which again was enclosed in an area, and we helped out with villagers and also our own troops. And then in 2003, I was on 2004 and 2003 and 4 when I was on active duty, not 4 and 5. 2003, 2004, active duty, I was at Fort McPherson. And then in 2005, I was in Ecuador again in the jungle. We did a medret then, and then in 2006, we were in Guatemala, where we worked with their cabillas and took care of our troops and also local villagers. So that's what I did for the 6 times overseas. In 1990, before I went to Honduras, my unit was actually activated for the Gulf War. So I volunteered for the Gulf War, and we had all ready to go, and they stood us down and took a unit out of Jacksonville. But I know we were upset because we were ready to go, and they stood us down. But the Army tells you what you do and don't do.
Right.
But we had all our shots and ready to roll.
Okay.
And that was basically, and then when I was on active duty,
Right.
I became assistant to the Army Reserve Surgeon. I was in charge of all the waivers for the Army Reservists who were being called up, mobilized, and deployed. So at that time, I wrote a big paper about it that was published in Military Medicine for the problems that we ran into with medical-wise in terms of mobilization and deployment.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I actually presented the data for the Pentagon and won a $500,000 grant from the Pentagon to study the medical issues in the reservists.
Oh.
And also at that time, I became the personal surgeon for the commander of the Army Reserve, General Helmley, 3-star, during the early years of the war for 2 years almost.
Okay.
So that, and plus our annual training, but that kind of sums things up
Right.
in terms of what I did in the U.S. Army.
Okay. That's fantastic. Okay. Were you ever a prisoner of war?
Pardon me?
Were you ever a prisoner of war?
Never.
Did you work? I believe yes, you did. So the answer, okay. But you worked in a combat zone.
Yes, we were in hostile zone.
Right. So
Hostile, I got hostile fire pay, yes.
being in the medical field, I take it for granted you saw a lot of casualties.
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't active war where I was, though, but I mean, they could have been shot. I mean, it was hostile area.
Okay.
Most of them were related to, falls, putting up tents, back injuries, broken bones. Infectious disease was one of the biggest problems that we ran into because I was all in tropical areas.
Right. Okay. I understand.
I even treated a chickenpox outbreak in El Salvador and their troops.
Really?
Yeah. So I saw a lot of tropical problems.
Okay. Did people in your unit, were there casualties in your unit?
Well, I mean, they got hurt.
Yeah.
Or they got sick, yeah, of
Okay.
course.
Okay. All right. So you saw a lot of that too, I would imagine.
And
Were you-
also in active duty when I saw a number of patients in the clinic that were coming back from Iraq
Right.
who were wounded or had problems or had PTSD.
Right.
So I took care of a lot of guys that were Vietnam vets, Gulf War vets, Iraqi war vets, so Afghanistan,
Okay. Were you ever a prisoner of war?
never.
Thank God. Okay. Did you, tell me about your awards, medals, citations.
Well, I think I received like 3 Army Commendation Medals, MSM, Military Service Medal, and also I published papers in the Military Medicine, and one of them won the award as the best paper of the year in military medicine and got the, I believe it was called the Welcome Award. So that was distinguished as the best paper in military medicine. And as I said, I also won, awarded $500,000 by the Pentagon
Right.
to study
Right.
mobilization problems and deployment problems for our soldiers.
Were you ever injured?
Well, I basically lost most of my hearing in an explosion at Fort Polk. I never applied for a disability on it or anything, but other than that, other than injuries where I, had severe problem with the bleeding into one of my arms after I fell. But, those are things that you have in the field. You get hurt and you treat it, but the biggest thing, as I said, was the hearing loss.
What was that explosion all about? You said Fort Polk.
Training.
Where is that?
Training.
What's it? What state?
That's in Louisiana.
Okay.
And I was supporting the 101st Airborne.
Mm-hmm.
They were getting ready to be deployed. I believe they were, I'm not sure the Iraqi war was getting ready to get started. So I was supporting these guys that were going to be going over from 101st, also 82nd Airborne. So they got hurt, but most of the training was with Miles gear, which was laser, but they did, when they fired off these 105 millimeter that were like the simulators for a grenade.
Uh-huh.
I mean, if you were too close, a problem.
Then you
And
called
I
it.
sewed up a lot that got injured and or broke a bones, and so I was involved with that.
Okay. Let's see. When you were overseas, were you able to stay in touch with your family?
Actually, when I was in the Amazon jungle, the first time I actually was able to make a satellite call
Oh, really?
and spoke to my wife a couple times.
Uh-huh.
When I was in, I think when I was in El Salvador, I was unable to be in touch with my family, so I didn't know what was going on. I worried about them.
Yeah.
Honduras, the same. I didn't have any contact. In fact, when I was in El Salvador the second time, my daughter was injured in Miami, and I really didn't have any contact. And the Red Cross got a hold of me and flew me out of the country because she was severely injured.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Sorry to hear that. So, how was the food?
Well, we ate the old MREs, and I wasn't a big fan of the MREs. I remember in the jungle I lost about, in the Amazon, in about 3 weeks I lost about 12 pounds. I didn't like the MREs. I would eat mostly the cake out of the MREs, and actually one of my buddies did a big study with MREs. If you eat the whole meal, a lot of our soldiers gain weight.
Really?
Yeah, that's how many, they had too many calories.
Oh, okay.
But the MREs later on became a lot better.
Really?
But I had a few episodes with what they served out of the MRE. I really couldn't eat them.
Got you.
But it took care of our troops, and then we had the, meals kind of, ready to eat. But the meals now are much, much better compared to in the beginning.
Okay. Did you have all the supplies that you needed on these, whether you were in country or out of country?
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up. When we went to Ecuador in 1987,
Right.
I was attached, the unit that was running it was out of Alabama. And as being the only doctor that was going to be there, I said, "Do you have medicine?" And they said, "Well, sir, we ordered $200,000 worth." I said, No. Is it there? I said, we need our medicine.
Yeah.
He said, "Well, I can't tell you that, but I know we ordered it." So I personally, with a buddy of mine at the VA, filled up a whole trunk with the best medicine that we had.
Okay.
And I personally carried that trunk with me to Ecuador. And when I was in the jungle, I opened it, I had a whole trunk full of antibiotics, you name it, the best. And as luck would have it, the medicine that the Army had ordered didn't get there for about 10 days.
Wow.
So we were using the supplies that I had brought, otherwise it would have been a real disaster.
Thank God for that, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember funny because in order to take that trunk, I wore my B uniform, which you're not supposed to do on the flight, but I did to save $25.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, when I got there, I got a citation. They said you shouldn't have worn it. And then when they found out it was the only medicine there, I got an Army Commendation Medal. So, but to me, it was like you had to do what you knew was the best thing for the troops. You
Right.
got to think out of the box.
Uh-huh.
And I lugged that thing all the way, along with my duffel bags, to do that.
Well, thank you. So this is
My job, you know what I mean?
This is a redundant. This is a ridiculous. This is a redundant question. Did you feel pressure or stress? We can skip that one. We can. You're a professional expert in that area, I believe.
In what?
Pressure and stress.
Oh, I mean, that's why I wanted to go to Iraq, because I wanted to study it. I mean,
Oh, really?
to me, yeah, I took care of a lot of PTSD patients, and but I ended up in headquarters. But every time I went overseas in hostile areas, I always would write a paper about it because to further that information, help out the medical next time and try to. One of the areas that I was interested in is trying to identify maybe groups that would be more prone to develop PTSD and other problems that they would run into. But, I ended up, not getting to go over, which I wanted to. I presented at the Forced Health Protection meeting twice in Albuquerque, Mexico, on studies that I had done for the Army Reserve based on our troops that were called up and were unable to be deployed. And a lot of the recommendations that we made in that paper are now used by the Army.
Okay, good. Okay, where'd you go on leave? Well, when you were on active duty, for that 20 months, didn't you take a break?
No more than 3 days at a time.
So where'd you go?
I just drove back 1,100 miles to see my wife.
Oh, okay.
That was only when I got like a 3-day weekend.
Right, yeah.
I drive one day, see my wife, and
turn around and come back.
Come back the next day,
Right.
but I didn't take any longer than that.
Okay. How did you get along with your fellow officers and the enlisted?
Well, as a commander, I mean, I love my troops.
Okay.
I was one of them.
Uh-huh.
I always said that I would never send them to do something I wouldn't do myself.
Gotcha.
In fact, I got a fitness badge every year, in our fitness test.
Right.
Because, I believe in that you really have to be there. In fact, when I took care of General Helmley, who was the commander of the reserve, he was a Vietnam vet, 2 tours, he used to say to me, he said, "Silverman, all soldiers are infantrymen." I didn't totally agree with him,
Right.
but because I knew because some of the medical issues that we had were almost comedic. Like we had one soldier that was called up for our annual training in the hot fields in Atlanta and Georgia
Right.
at Fort Augusta. I remember that he weighed about 300 pounds and had to use CPAP at night. We sent him back right away.
Uh-huh.
But the question was, how could he still be in the reserve?
Right.
So
Yeah.
we tried to make it so that, but there's still a bit of a controversy about that, because people that have certain expertise you need. They may not be deployable, but they can really help out. So I still haven't solved that, and I never got to do that, but that was one of my big interests.
Okay. Okay. So you remember when did you retire? What year?
2006.
And I guess you were apparently here. Were you here at?
I was
in
in
Palm Beach County?
Miami, Florida.
Are you in Miami? Okay.
And if I had it to do over, I would have stayed on active duty longer.
Uh-huh.
And also, I would have probably been able to stay in, because the reason that I really had to get out was my hearing.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay.
And they were going to call me back up to go to Fort Bragg
Oh, really?
to be the internist there, but I didn't do very well in my hearing test for obvious reasons.
I understand.
35 years military, and years ago as a musician, and as you get older, it's not uncommon.
It doesn't get better.
No.
So when you got out in Miami, what'd you do? Did you stay there for a while, or did you come up here?
Well, I retired in 2006. I came up here in 2011.
Okay. All right.
But I worked with the Miami VA for many years also.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So I was very active with them.
Okay.
I was full-time and
How long
then
were you with them?
part-time. Well, I've been with the VA a total of,
All right. Where were we? Can you remember where were we?
when I left Miami, or...
Yeah. Well, that's okay. Just pick it up there. That's fine.
Yeah, so now I was saying that I work with the VA for 23 years and military Army 35. So I look at it, I've been blessed to be able to take care of our soldiers for so long, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard.
Right.
In fact, 1 year I actually worked as a flight surgeon at the U.S. Coast Guard station in Miami on loan from the Army. But to me, what I try to do is, besides obviously care for our vets, is to have people realize that everyone has a story to tell. And that I see now a lot of the people that I work with are getting these stories in terms of, I have a vet from First Wave Omaha Beach, Normandy, or First Wave Iwo Jima, Second Wave Iwo Jima. I just admitted a pilot who flew the P-47 in the Battle of the Bulge to support Patton and the troops. I mean, to me, this is living history. And that's why our vets are so special. And I try and impart that to all the physicians and all the providers and healthcare personnel about how very special our veterans are, men and women.
Okay. So when you, just to go back, I just got a couple more questions.
Sure.
All right. Well, actually, so you got your full education while you were in the military?
No.
You got it before?
I joined after I was an MD.
After you, okay. All right. So just to wrap this up, tell me how did your military experience affect your life?
I think that it made me a much better person. It taught me discipline, caring, and realized that our military is why we're free, and it's the greatest, I say, group of people in the world. And to me, to be able to participate for so many years, even though I was in some tough areas, it was all a blessing. And I feel good that I was able to keep other of our soldiers in, talk to them, be a mentor for them to stay and enjoy their service, because there's nothing greater. I mean, I would have stayed in longer if I couldn't hear anymore, but to me, it made me a much, much better person. You can't beat it.
Have you maintained a lot of your friendships after the service?
Yeah, in fact, a number of the people that work here at the VA, I was their commander 100 years ago.
Okay.
And so I see them all the time, and they come up to me, and a number ended up in Iraq and were affected by it.
Right.
So they come to me like a Papa Bear
Right.
to talk to them, and these guys are special. The only thing that I really wanted and never got to do was to get over there with them.
I hear you.
And that's what I wanted to do. Every time they went over, I wanted to be with them.
Right.
Gulf in Iraq, and it just wasn't to be, but you know, I would have done it again, and I think everyone should spend a couple of years at least in the military.
I hear you. Well, I want to thank you for your service, and thank you for a wonderful interview.
Well, it's an honor to me to be involved with my troops still, and a blessing. And I look at it that way, and I tell all the vets, because I take care of hospice also. I run our hospice.
Right.
And at the end of life, I mean, to me, they deserve the respect, dignity, and honor of having served our country. That's it.
Thank you.